Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Meryl and I live in the city of Portland and have lived and grown up in this incredible part of the world all of my life. My extraordinary Bigfoot encounter happened to me in 2018 in an exquisite dreamy woodland area in the Oregon countryside, where the last thing that you would expect to encounter would be a Bigfoot. But then Bigfoots do have an uncanny way of turning up in the most unlikely of places when you're least expecting an encounter. If you're looking for the critter, you mark my words, you'll never ever find him, because that's the way the cookie always crumbles. I recently began a nursing career working at a Portland hospital, and so I was renting out a room in a very large, exquisite home in a peaceful green leafy suburb known as Alamanda that possesses exquisite views of downtown Portland, the Willamette River and the Cascade Mountains. Many of the turn-of-the-century houses located in this picturesque, charming street are home to generations of families that have lived in these homes since the early 50s. Some of these historic treasures have been restored to their former original glory, so the street is naturally full of large properties that are in pristine condition with so much character, charm and mysterious intrigue. I adore this neighbourhood because it is so serene, quiet and peaceful, which I love, and there are people walking and jogging everywhere. It has very sizable sidewalks, ubiquitous trees, emerald green manicured lawns, and loads of green leafy parks, and yet it's in close proximity to shops and other amenities, so it really is a prime idyllic location. I was renting out my own bedroom as a live-in tenant in this large, recently restored colonial-styled home in Alamanda, where the upper floors were all bedrooms and the family room and kitchen were on the first floor, which is ideal for tenants. There were 3 of us nurses living together under this large cosy roof, with all of us possessing our very own spacious bedrooms that had been sumptuously decorated, along with our own luxurious sooty bathroom en suites. We were renting and sharing this awesome living space with an elderly 80-year-old lady called May, who was a lively, humorous and fun-loving person with a quirky sense of humour who had lived in this gorgeous house virtually all her life. May's husband had passed away several years earlier and her kids flown the nest, so it really was a large mansion for one person to handle all on their own, which was why she decided to let out rooms in her lavish abode, as she believed emphatically that sharing her space with some young blood would be incredibly good for her. We all helped supervise around the home with an organised rota system where we all took turns in doing the shopping, laundry, cooking and cleaning, and even some yard work to keep the house in pristine condition. May's place was like an extension of our very own homes, because that was how welcome she made us feel living in her elaborate, plush and splendiferous dwelling. May was not your typical 80-year-old woman, but was much more like a young person wearing an elderly skin. To look at, you would never believe her to be a day over 70, as her peachy complexion was both firm and unlined, and her blue eyes sparkled with life. She had the smile of a Hollywood star, with the most perfect set of pearly white teeth, but they were all her own, and her body was in great shape, with no signs of early arthritis or weakening of bones that you invariably see in older people. Despite her advancing years, she was robust, energetic, and full of beans. May had 2 beloved cats in her life that were like her very own children, and they quite literally adored her. Every evening while we watched TV together, both those cats would lie on her lap and purr contentedly. One of her dearly beloved cats was called Jasper, and the other was called Catkins, and they were both marmalade cats with the most adorable personalities. May would often tell us that they brought her so much joy into her life that she couldn't even imagine her life without them. "You know what I love about my fairy children," she would say over and over again. "They never abandon you like your own family does when they fly the nest, and you barely ever hear from them again. My 2 flesh and blood children hardly ever contact me these days. They're so busy with their lives in Boston, raising their own families. They haven't got time for a silly old bat like me." "You're not a silly old bat," I protested. "My beautiful cats love me so unconditionally, without ever judging me, and they're with me every day of my life, and they're the greatest source of comfort I've ever known." "They're here for all of us," I assured May, "because cats always make life so much richer and fuller. I adore coming back from nursing and seeing Jasper and Catkins curled up on the couch, because it's such a homely feeling, and just watching them makes me relax, especially after a stressed day at work, dealing with difficult, tumultuous patients, let me tell you." "It's true," said Caroline, who was one of May's tenants. "I was told once that people would not be able to manage the stresses of everyday life without the addition of animals, because life would be pretty much impossible to live without them." It's true, I reflected. I heard once that people who have pets actually live longer and healthier lives than people who don't, because animals have been proven to literally lower blood pressure and reduce levels of stress. "Well, maybe that's why I'm in such good shape," May reflected, as she submersed the dirty dishes from our dinner into a large hot sink of bubbling, foaming water and began to wash them with a brush. And once she'd cleaned them, she handed them over to me to dry with a towel, while Caroline finally replaced them back in the cupboards where they belonged. "The doctor tells me I'm a very healthy individual," May continued. "No high blood pressure or diabetes, and never had a sick day in my life," she declared proudly. "I can't say any of my friends have been quite so lucky as I have," she said. "I think these cats have a lot to do with my good health, so there's something in what you say." "It's because animals increase your level of immunity," I told her. "It's a very well-established fact, and has been scientifically proven. I notice that when I'm nursing sick patients who've pets of their own, they always recover so much more speedily than those who don't. They also can't wait to get back to their animals, and they talk about them incessantly when they're in hospital." "Well, that makes perfect sense to me," said May. "Oh, talking about animals, that reminds me," she said, regarding me with a concerned expression on her face. "My cats both need their vaccinations done, but I like to take them to my local vet, Mr. Mandel, who used to be close by, but is now based in the countryside, which is about 30 minutes out of town. My cats know him very well, you see, and I'd rather not use anybody else. Could you take them for their yearly appointment for me? I'd be so terribly grateful. I know it's a little way out, but as I don't drive, it would be such a help." "I'd happily take them for you, May," I told her. "I have a day off tomorrow, so it wouldn't be any trouble at all. And besides, a drive in the countryside would be a very pleasant excursion for me. It's good to get out of town." I felt happy to do May a favour, as she did so much for us as tenants, making us delicious meals, cakes and homemade breads, and was often seen doing our ironing and washing for us, and going out of her way to make our lives a lot easier. It was the least I could do to extend a helping hand, and I was thrilled to return a favour. The following morning I packed the 2 ginger cats into their baskets in the back of my car, and off I went to the veterinary surgery, which was about 30 minutes outside town, and in a stunning, beautiful location. I used my GPS to find the surgery that was like a bright pink building that was attached to the front of a residential farmhouse. The whole landscape was surrounded by exquisite views, beautiful green pastures, and vast areas of dreamy forest, consisting of tall, statuesque, rather imposing trees. I gather the vet was now in his advancing years, but was still practising and decided to move away from Portland to this idyllic part of the world, and most of his regulars who had visited his surgery in downtown Portland were willing to make the extra 30-minute trip because he was such a trusted and respected vet. May was one of his long-time clients who had visited his practices for over 25 years and had absolutely no desire to change her vet any time soon. As I grabbed the cat baskets out of the back of the car, I could tell that both ginger tabbies had grown restless and weary from the journey and seemed agitated and far from pleased as they were protesting and meowing furiously, especially Catkins, who was making a huge commotion. Suddenly, to my horror, Catkins managed to push open the basket with her paws, and she escaped over the open road, where she ran as fast as she could, bounding into the forest like greased lightning, and was gone from my sight. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. Surely I'd locked her securely in her basket. The horrendous shock that had just transpired before my eyes seemed so hauntingly surreal. It hit me so hard, like a block of ice being thrust in my face. My heart sank into feelings of harrowing despair and hopelessness. How could this have happened to me? Catkins was May's world. How could I possibly return home without her cat? I knew this was a monumental catastrophe, as far as I was concerned. May would be absolutely devastated to lose her cat like this, in a situation that so easily could have been avoided, if only I'd been paying attention and locked the cat safely in their basket. I couldn't believe I'd been so careless, clumsy and cack-handed. If I behaved in this negligent way as a nurse, I would ultimately lose my job in a heartbeat. Imagine if I forgot to inject a patient on time, or I ultimately gave them the wrong pills. I would be in heaps of trouble. Yet I couldn't be trusted to deliver a cat safely to the surgery. I was furious with myself. It was inconceivable returning home without Catkins, because it would quite literally break May's heart. How could I disappoint the lovely old lady who was more like a mother to me than my own mother had ever been? I had never felt so dreadfully responsible for something in my entire life as I did now. My generous favour had turned into a ghastly nightmare from which there seemed no escape. What in God's name was I going to do now? "You'll never find that cat in that wooded area," the vet assured me. "You'll have to put it down to one of those dreadful accidents that invariably happen sometimes. Looking for her in those woods will be like looking for a needle in a haystack. I'd leave it if I were you, because you'll only be wasting your time. You'll never ever find her." "I cannot do that," I told the vet. "Do you not see that it's my fault the cat actually escaped? Because I failed to lock the basket securely. I need to find that cat, because Catkins is like a child to May. It would absolutely destroy her if I returned home empty-handed without her beloved baby. I couldn't live with myself." Oh dear," said the vet. "This is the problem when people love animals too much. These dreadful things happen. Surely she'll understand. I've known May for a very long time, and she's a lovely, lovely lady with a very generous heart. If anyone can forgive you, she surely can." "Look," I said to the vet, "I know you mean well, but I can't forgive myself if I don't at least try and retrieve the cat. He ran into the woods over there across the road, and I'm going in there after him. There's nothing more to be said for it." "Good luck," said the vet. "You're going to need it. I'm glad I'm not wearing your shoes this morning." I left Jasper in the pet's care to receive his annual vaccinations, and quickly dashed over the road to the wooded area where Catkins had gone missing. "Oh, please, God," I prayed in my heart. "I haven't asked you for anything before. Well, not really. But now I'm asking you for a huge miracle, to save an elderly woman from breaking her heart. Please help me find Catkins. It's a matter of extreme urgency, God. It's a matter of life and death." As I entered the beautiful wooded area, it was like being immersed in a magical wonderland, as the woods were so serene and peaceful, with tall statuesque trees that rose up in the firmament like masterful green giants. I noticed that there was red alder, dogwood, white oaks and maple trees, and they were all impressive mature trees with substantial girths. The forest was covered with pretty green undergrowth, from ferns and rambling greenery, some that was flowering with pretty pink flowers, and the whole area was alive with pretty birdsong. It was all so enchanting and idyllic that for a moment I forgot why I was in the pretty forest in the first place. The woods were sheltered from the midday sun by a cooling canopy created by the enveloped leafy branches that covered my head. "Catkins," I called. "Pussy, pussy, Catkins." For a long while I walked through the forest searching for the cat and looking up tree branches to see if I could see her there, but she was nowhere in sight, and she was not responding to my desperate calls. "Catkins, Catkins, Catkins." Suddenly, to my amazement, as I was looking up a tree, I observed this huge humanoid silhouette staring down at me from a great height. He was standing on a branch with the agility and grace of a monkey, but this thing was not a monkey. It was looking down at me with curious interest in very bright, congenial brown eyes. It was the strangest creature that I've ever observed in my entire life. It was covered from head to toe with long auburn-coloured hair that appeared rather matted and tangled, which was a pity because the hair was beautiful. It looked like a hairy human with ape-like influences, and I realised almost at once that it was a Bigfoot. I had heard about these creatures before, but I'm afraid I was never a believer in the existence of such mysterious critters. But now here I was, staring at one of these creatures face to face, and there was no doubt that this was a Bigfoot. I could hardly believe it. Only recently I'd been really horrible to my little brother, teasing him for his Bigfoot poster on the wall, and I told him that Bigfoot was as spurious as Father Christmas and the Tooth Fairy, and there was no such creature in existence. "But they are real," he had protested, his eyes filling with tears. "Why are you being so cruel?" My mother also scolded me. "Honestly, Merrill, why are you being so mean to your little brother? If he believes in Bigfoot, why are you trying to rob him of his fantasy?" "Because, Mum," I said, "why would you want to fill his little head with nonsense? The critter is not real. It's as simple as that." "Well, that's what they said about the panda bear once, and that wasn't long ago," said my mother. "And there were people like you all saying that the critter didn't exist, until all the doubters were put in their place as they eventually proved that the panda was indeed real." Was this the universe now poking a face at me, I wondered, and having a huge dig, because I was so wrong? Bigfoot was real, and now I owed my brother a huge apology. Although the creature was very large and imposing, with a very sturdy, powerful build and overlong arms, with a typical cone-shaped head, at no time was it remotely aggressive or hostile towards me, but looked at me with an angst, rather confused expression on its face that seemed to say, "Who are you? What are you doing here? And what do you want?" It seemed more perturbed and surprised as to my presence in these woods, which I guess was not rarely frequented by many people. I looked up at the Bigfoot, and our eyes locked in a warm embrace. I sensed the creature was a kindly, gentle soul. It's difficult for me to estimate his weight, height, or girth, but at a guess I would say he was about 6 foot tall, 3 foot wide, and 500 pounds. Suddenly my attention was diverted away from the Bigfoot, as in my peripheral vision I saw a ginger-haired creature crawling up a large tree yards away from where I was standing. At first I thought it was a red squirrel, but to my amazement it was Catkins. I could tell by the cat-like paw and claws that dug into the tree trunk as he glided up the branch. I ran over to the tree in absolute delight and called out to Catkins, "Catkins, Catkins, it's me, come down! Catkins, it's me, come down, Catkins!" Catkins' ginger head peered down at me from a great height, and she refused to come down. It was like she was saying, "I'm up here, and I refuse to budge." She had that smug, self-satisfied look on her cheeky feline face, and at the best of times was a very stubborn cat, with a mind all of her own. How on earth was I going to get this obstinate, mischievous ginger tabby down? I kept calling and calling her, and "Catkins, please come down! Catkins, please come down!" I was almost crying, I was so desperate, and I was so focused on my mission in hand, I'd almost forgotten the Bigfoot standing in the next tree observing the strange commotion unfolding before his very eyes. He looked a little confused, baffled, and muddled by my obsession with a strange bundle of ginger hair perched on the tree branch that was staring down at me with a churlish expression on his face, almost as if it was saying, "I'm not coming down." The Bigfoot remained standing on the tree branch, watching me intently with wide eyes, trying to make sense of what I was actually doing. I suddenly had an idea, and actually pointed to the cat in the tree and to my cat basket, and proceeded to act out to the Bigfoot, getting the cat and putting it in the basket. I did this several times. Maybe the Bigfoot would be able to help me retrieve catkins. The Bigfoot seemed to understand and made a chattering sound, and he literally dived from one tree branch to another until he was standing yards away from catkins. The way he moved was so effortless, like orangutan in a tree. He was breathtaking to watch. Catkins got the fright of her life to see the hairy humanoid standing yards away from her. Her ears went right back, and her hair stood on end. She virtually doubled in size in an instant, and began to growl and lash out with her paws at the creature. I think she thought the Bigfoot was going to eat her, and she put up a huge fight. But the Bigfoot was not easily put off, and grabbed her in his huge sausage-like hands. I watched in awe as the Bigfoot jumped onto the ground and landed on his padded paws, or feet, rather like my cat, and he put catkins into her cat basket, which I immediately locked. This was such a miracle. Not only did I get the cat back, but this mythical creature that so many of us refuse to believe is real helped me retrieve May's cat. I could hardly believe it. I tried to thank the creature, who bounced back to his tree and stood there watching me as I left the forest. I bet he was wondering why I was so interested in this angry, volatile ginger cat. When I returned to the surgery with Catkin in my basket, the vet nearly had a heart attack. "How the hell did you manage to find her?" he asked me in amazement. "I'd have put money on you never finding her again." "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," I said, with a mischievous twinkle in my eyes. I was not about to divulge my Bigfoot experience to him. I was finding the whole event difficult to process myself. When I returned the 2 ginger cats to May, she thanked me for doing her a huge favour. "I knew I could rely on you, Meryl," she said. "You never ever let me down." Can you believe it? I actually said, "Any time. It wasn't any trouble at all." That night I did some research on Bigfoot, and I realised how privileged I was to meet such an incredible creature, and I also learnt about the act of gifting, and so after a little shopping in Portland, I brought a large basket of mixed fruit and nuts and took them to the area where I'd seen the Bigfoot and left them under the tree. I called out my cat's name, and then suddenly he appeared out of nowhere. I know he recognised my voice and immediately responded to my call. I was amazed. I pointed to the basket of fruit, and he grabbed it happily and gave me a delighted look and made an excited chattering sound and glided away into the forest, whistling happily to himself. He was absolutely elated with my gift. I am elated that we got Catkins back. I'm glad to tell you that I made amends with my little brother as well, and told him that I did believe in Bigfoot, but I was not going to tell him about my encounter that had changed my mind. That would be going way too far for me. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Ellie, and my strange story begins when I was living and working in downtown Seattle as a local vet in the area. I was happily married at the time, and still am, to my husband Piers and 2 younger children, Agnes, who was 8, and her brother James, who was 5 at the time. Everything changed very dramatically in my life when I discovered that a great uncle of mine had left me his entire fortune, which included his large estate, which meant I now owned a beautiful country farmhouse in West Virginia that was situated on a vast acreage of land. I could not believe how fortunate and blessed I was to be left such a great inheritance. I had never known or met my great uncle before. Well, not that I could recall anyway. The fact that he had left me this entire estate came as a bolt out of the blue. To cut a long story short, when my husband and I visited the old farmhouse in Virginia, we knew that we wanted to relocate and to raise our children in this extraordinary, alluring and idyllic part of the world, and so that is exactly what we did. We felt raising our kids in such an exquisite, enchanting rural setting would be a huge privilege for our kids and offer them a really rather spectacular childhood, something that I wished I'd had. We moved into our attractive restored farmhouse, which had initially been built in 1910, after we had renovated it in such a way that it met our immediate needs as a growing family, such as introducing larger bedroom sizes for the kids, with greater storage space for all their stuff. In addition, we also incorporated large picture windows throughout that made the most of the arresting panoramic views of the countryside, which was so incredibly breathtaking. There were times I literally had to pinch myself to assure myself that this picture or retreat was indeed our new home. I did my level best to preserve the historic integrity and character of this charming white house, with its green roof and matching windows. To top it all up, our dwelling was surrounded with an impressive colonnaded portico, so typical of the 1900s. It was so perfectly nestled in the heart of the valley, which was surrounded by rolling green hills, some pretty pasture land, interesting rocky outcrops, and a beautiful silvery lake that was flanked by a vast area of dreamy forest. This pleasing woodland retreat protracted back for many miles, which was teeming with indigenous wildlife, which we would invariably see regularly frolicking across the green grass, most especially the ever so serene and gentle white-tailed deer, and of course rabbits, not to mention raccoons and foxes that often visited our premises at night. No sooner had we moved into our beautiful new abode, my daughter Agnes kept telling me that she was seeing dead people walking in her room at night. She told me that some of them were dressed funny in strange old-fashioned clothes, like bustle skirts and long-sleeved lacy tops, while she would see men wearing tails and top hats. My daughter told me that she could actually hear their boots and physically feel the vibration as they walked past her across the oak floor towards her wardrobe, and they would walk straight through it as if there was no physical boundary blocking their path whatsoever, and would promptly disappear before her very eyes. When my daughter told me this, I was naturally very alarmed, as the last thing you want to hear from your daughter is that she's seeing the dead. What was surprising to me was that for a young girl, she didn't seem unduly alarmed or afraid by her bizarre, outer-worldly, ethereal experiences, as you would have expected. "How do you know they're dead?" I asked her. "Because the man in the big black hat told me they were dead," she said. "He told me not to let the others know that I could actually see them." "Why did he say that to you?" I asked in surprise. "He told me that if they knew I could see them, they would bother me, because they would want me to send messages for them to people who are alive on the earth, and they would not stop bugging me and being very annoying." "What was this man's name that told you this?" I asked in amazement. "His name was Herbert. He said he was born in this house in 1915, she told me. He told me he was related to me by blood." "Well, you must listen to Herbert," I told my daughter, "and don't let those dead people know that you can see them. He obviously knows what he's talking about." I honestly did not know what to think, as I came from a deeply religious background myself, and so all this stuff concerning seeing dead people in my home was indeed disconcerting, and I was very disturbed. I was fortunately able to find an old picture of Herbert that belonged to my great-uncle, and I left the photograph lying around the house to see if my daughter would respond to it, and sure enough she came running into the kitchen, showing me the photograph that she was holding in her hands, with a look of flustered excitement on her face. "This is the nice dead man! Remember, I told you about him, Herbert, who talks to me in my bedroom at night. He's a really nice man, Mum, and not scary like some of them are." I was now resolute that my daughter was indeed seeing dead people, and I realised I needed to get some help, and I did some research and called a priest and a medium to visit our home to talk to my daughter and to find out exactly what was going on. As you can imagine, I wasn't remotely comfortable with all this outer-worldly stuff. I'd grown up to believe that ghosts were demonic beings. But then, why on earth was my innocent young daughter so open to seeing these dead entities walking around her bedroom at night? None of it made any sense to me whatsoever, and was beyond my realm of comprehension or understanding. I spoke at length about this horrifying issue to my husband, who believed my daughter would grow out of seeing these strange apparitions. "I think kids are more sensitive to the paranormal than adults, but I'm sure she'll outgrow these visions of hers." He told me this in such a nonchalant way, as if it was no big deal. I soon learnt that his own mother had seen dead people when she was a child, and so I now knew where my daughter had inherited her gift from. When the medium arrived at my house, she was a pretty young woman called Melody, with dark hair, fair skin and soulful blue eyes, and she was dressed in a long flowing, rather bohemian-looking leopard skin dress. "Hello," she said. "It's really good to meet you. I'd like to introduce you to my work partner," she said, introducing me to the priest. "This is Father Montgomery. We often work together as a team, investigating hauntings, possessions, poltergeist activity, and all kinds of paranormal stuff. We've pretty much seen and done it all, so there's not much that will surprise us. Good, I said. That's very reassuring to hear. Before we finally meet your daughter, I'd like to see the room where your daughter claims to be seeing all these dead people, if you don't mind. As I showed Melody around my home, she asked me if we'd recently renovated our house, and I told her that indeed we had. As I thought, she said, nodding. There's nothing like stirring up ghostly activity more than a restoration of an old home. It happens all the time. Before long we were all climbing the stairs, and I led Melody and Father Montgomery into my daughter's bedroom. Melody stood very still like a statue frozen in time as she entered the bedroom, and I noticed her eyes fixed on the closet in my daughter's room for a very long time. I also observed that her eyes seemed to notice things that neither Father Montgomery or I could actually see. "You have a very large portal open in this room," she said. "The best way I can describe it is like a train station that opens into our reality, for the dead, where they can enter and leave at will, and the portal is in your daughter's closet over there. I can see it's a large opening that needs to be closed, because it can draw good and bad entities throughout this opening. It could potentially be problematic for your daughter if we don't close it. Your daughter's psychic ability would be like a magnet to the dead. I can tell that your daughter being able to see this clearly makes me believe that she has a very powerful psychic gift." I gasped. "Please don't tell me that. That's the last thing I need to hear." It's difficult for parents to be able to accept their children having a psychic gift because it frightens them, as we're always fearful of what we don't understand, and so we block it out rather than make sense of it, she told me. You see, we all have an inbuilt paradigm of the world, and if things don't conform to our perception of reality, we have a subconscious way of refusing to believe it or dismissing it out of hand as all just being nonsense. For many people, having to accept the paranormal exists is something that forces us to concede that there is so much more to this world than we can actually physically imagine or see. And that is incredibly unnerving for a lot of people who like to be in control of their lives, and not being able to control the things they cannot see makes them uneasy and very insecure. We all like to feel that we're in control to some degree of our lives. Your daughter can see beyond the veil, and so she needs to remain very grounded and strong, and to learn how to manage her gift effectively so that she's always in control, and not the other way round, if you understand what I'm saying. I can teach her how to handle this invisible world, much like switching a button on and off, so that she can live a relatively normal life. Before long, Father Montgomery and Melody spoke to my daughter and discussed everything that she could see in our home, and my daughter talked at length about her friendship with the ghost of Herbert, who travelled in and out of our reality, and was intent on protecting my daughter, and was disquieted by my daughter's psychic gift, because he was worried about other dead people suddenly taking advantage of her, something that Melody rarely did understand. Father Montgomery blessed our entire home, and then Melody closed the portal in my daughter's bedroom, and she told me that things should settle down in our home before long, and I'm glad to say that they actually did. My daughter no longer reported seeing dead people walking around her bedroom at night, nor did the mysterious figure of Herbert come to visit her anymore, much to my huge relief. I put the haunting memory of those paranormal episodes behind me, almost as if they'd never actually existed. It was easier for me that way, to push that bizarre phenomenon behind me, rather than acknowledge to myself that these strange anomalies had indeed occurred in my home. Soon I was enjoying my life in the West Virginian countryside and doing regular part-time shifts at the local vets, while my husband was working freelance with his landscape gardening business. He'd recruited several burly, rather strapping-looking lads on his team, and the business appeared to be thriving. We were able to both share the responsibility of taking charge over our children by alternating our shifts, and so things invariably worked out incredibly well. One morning when my husband was out working and I was watching the children, I asked them to go and pick berries for me from the hedgerows, as the seasonal berries were plentiful this year. I gave them a basket to busy themselves with the picking, while I set up my canvas on an easel and proceeded to paint the landscape, while keeping a steely eye on both of my children. I'd recently started art classes and was learning to work with oils on canvas, and I was really enjoying the whole experimental process of working with paint and slowly developing a passion for everything. I could hear my kids chuckling in the background, and their mouths were stained in bright crimson berry juice as they picked and ate the berries. They chased each other around the hedgerows, all the while laughing, giggling and having so much fun. James was hosing my daughter down with his spray gun, and my daughter was shrieking in delight. My children loved it out here, and they adored their new lives in the country. "Don't eat them all," I teased, "or I won't be able to make any jams or jelly. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mum," they said. Soon I was so caught up in my painting and so absorbed that I realised I hadn't heard my children giggling for quite a while. I breathed a huge sigh of relief when I looked up from my painting and saw my daughter still busily picking and eating berries. I could see her basket was heaving with the fruit, and she had done an awesome job in collecting so much. "Well done," I said. "I think that's enough. Let's go back to the house for some cold lemonade, shall we? I don't know about you, but I'm rather parched." "And some chocolate biscuits," she chirruped. "Very well," I said. "Chocolate biscuits and lemonade it is." "Where's your brother?" I asked. "The bear took him," my daughter said, in such a nonchalant, matter-of-fact tone, as if it was perfectly normal for bears to pick up little kids and take them for rides. "What are you talking about?" I asked, looking at my daughter with an agog expression on my face. "The bear took him," she repeated, "for a piggyback ride. You know, a piggyback." I looked at my daughter with the most horrified expression on my face. "What bear?" I asked. "Tell me, what did you see? What bear are you talking about?" "He was a big hairy bear, with a human-like face," she said, smiling jubilantly. "He was very nice. He offered to give me a ride also, but I told him to take my brother first. He said he'll come back for me next, but only if I wait here for him." "You stupid girl," I snapped angrily. "Why would you let this man take your brother like that? You know you're not supposed to go with strangers." My daughter began to cry. "I told you, it was a bear. It was not a man," she insisted. "Did he speak to you like I'm speaking to you now?" I asked suddenly. My daughter thought about it for a while. "No," she said. "He spoke to me in my head." "Where did he go?" I asked my daughter. "He promised he'd bring James back. He wasn't lying, Mum. I know he wasn't lying. He never, ever lies." "How do you know that?" I asked my daughter. My daughter looked confused for a moment. "Sometimes I just know things," she explained. "Like I knew we'd live in this house because I saw this house in my head before we ever came to live here. Remember, I drew it for you. You said it was an accurate picture." "That's right," I said. "You did. I do remember that your picture was very, very accurate. You're right about that." "I also knew when Granny was going to die," she reminded me. "Remember, I told you the night before she went away and she left us." I looked at my daughter in consternation, and the memory came flooding back. I remember I'd been reading a book on my bed when my daughter had come in and told me that she'd seen Granny, who told her she was going far away and to say goodbye to everybody. She also told me to be a good girl, my daughter had told me. I remember the very next day that the nursing home had actually phoned me to tell me that my mother had passed away during the night. My daughter was right about that. I suddenly remembered my daughter's psychic ability, and I realised she had read the strange creature's energy, and whatever this bear was, he clearly communicated with her telepathically, and she could sense that the creature had good intentions towards my son. Could she be right, I wondered, or had the creature literally deceived her? "Sweetheart," I said to her, "are you absolutely sure that this bear you saw will not harm your brother?" My daughter burst out laughing. "He'd never, ever hurt him," she giggled. "He's ever so nice. He'll bring James back, if he sees you're not around." She said this very suddenly. "He's not very sure about you." I decided to trust my daughter's psychic ability for a moment. I mean, what did I have to lose? My gut instincts told me to listen to her, because something in my gut believed that she was right. If I called the police, things could go terribly wrong, and the so-called bear could bolt away, and I'd be unable to retrieve my son. I told my daughter to go to her bedroom and proceeded to hide behind a tree that was close to the hedgerow, where I believe I could remain concealed without being observed by this mysterious bear, or whatever the creature was. Alarming thoughts whirled and whizzed around my head like a washing machine in full throttle. What if this? What if that? Came the thoughts barging into my head like an uninvited, unwanted intruder that was eager to remind me of all my shortcomings as a mother. I was beginning to wonder if a man wearing a bear suit had surreptitiously sneaked onto our property and tried to abduct my kids. It would be natural for kids to be excited about a man that looked like a bear offering them piggybacks. I knew how my kids loved the man wearing the green dragon outfit at Walmart, who was promoting a new brand of sparkling lemonade. My 2 kids had loved the man as he'd wiggled around the store, causing all the kids to laugh out hysterically. And subsequently I'd returned home with trolley loads of this lemonade, as my kids knew that such a purchase was very pleasing for the big green dragon, and they talked relentlessly about the green dragon for many days after that. Quite suddenly I heard the sound of my son James chuckling, and I saw that he was riding on the back of the most colossal creature that I'd ever observed in my entire life, which I realised immediately was most certainly not a bear, nor was it a man, but it was very definitely, without question, a Bigfoot. Bear in mind I'm a vet, and over the years I've heard of people discussing this elusive, mysterious beast called Bigfoot that was supposed to roam the forests of North America. But to be blatantly honest with you, I never believed a word of any of it. I'd assumed that anyone who remotely believed the spurious creature to be actually true was about as nutty as a fruitcake, or clearly missing a few marbles. Yet standing yards away from me, larger than life, carrying my son on his shoulders, was a Bigfoot, and the critter was absolutely colossal. I would say he was easily 10 foot tall, 4 foot wide, and 900 to 1,000 pounds, and was covered in long flowing auburn hair that was a little tangled and matted, but if it was brushed it would look superb, because the colour was utterly phenomenal. I noticed the creature was so powerfully strong, as every part of his body was ripped with muscle definition, that most bodybuilders would strive their entire lives to achieve, with countless hours spent working out in the gym and consuming an excessive amount of protein to bulk up, and probably even taking some steroids to boot. I'm in no doubt that this creature's genealogy is built for power, strength and speed, and you could class him quite literally as an apex predator, easily in line with a tiger or a lion. I was in absolute awe, and I was stunned at what I was observing, but I restrained myself from rushing towards the Bigfoot, which as a mother is the hardest thing to do. But my daughter had described the creature as being very wary and reticent of me. The last thing I wanted was to scare the Bigfoot off so that he'd run away with my kid. It looked like he'd actually brought my child back to the hedgerows where he'd been initially gathering fruit. I watched as the Bigfoot lowered my son to the ground and pointed towards our home, as if telling my son to go back to the house. I was exceedingly frustrated when my kid was begging the Bigfoot for another ride and was having one of his childlike tantrums. I actually felt exceedingly embarrassed by my child's insolent behaviour. "I want another ride! I want another ride! I want another ride!" He kept crying, "I want another ride," and stamping his foot in defiance. I couldn't believe my kid was behaving like such a spoilt, petulant brat. The Bigfoot patted his head in a gentle, kindly gesture and made a chattering sound that was almost like a language of some kind. It was like he was trying to calm down my little ungrateful child. Once again he pointed to the house, and my son started tottering towards the house, looking far from pleased. He was stamping his foot, and he was showing as much gratitude for his ride as a spoilt rich kid that always invariably gets his way. Had I brought up my child to be such a thankless brat, I wondered? Even though I was furious with the hairy critter for scaring me half to death by taking my child off like that, I was torn between a rock and a hard place. I was equally as ashamed of my child's abysmal behaviour. Talk about lack of gratitude. I could hardly believe it. I watched the Bigfoot turn around and glide seamlessly into the forest, and he moved with such a flawless grace. What an incredible creature, I found myself thinking. When I returned back to the house, I gave my son a very hard time about accepting a ride from a stranger, and I told him to never accept a ride from Bigfoot ever again. He tottered away and sulked all night, and told me that I was a very horrible mother for not letting him have rides with a very nice bear. "Something bad could have happened to you," I scolded him. Fast forward a few years, and I never actually told my husband about the Bigfoot on our land, who had given our son a piggyback. I didn't think somehow that would go down too well with him. I also couldn't get my head around what had actually transpired, so I was hardly going to share my story with anyone for fear of being ridiculed or disbelieved. I always had a way of avoiding or talking about things that unsettled me. I guess it's always been my way of kind of dealing with things, I suppose. At that time, I warned my children to never accept rides from anyone, whether they were human beings, bears, kangaroos, or dragons. Accepting a ride from a critter was not a good idea and was strictly forbidden. My daughter is now 19 years old, and when I told her I was writing to you about my Bigfoot encounter, she told me that they never listened to me when I told them not to have rides with the Bigfoot all those years ago. She said that as kids, he had taken them for many rides several times behind my back, over many years. She said to me, "Mum, please don't be mad. That Bigfoot was such a nice fellow. I knew he'd never ever hurt us. He was so gentle. And I can't expect you to understand that, but I knew that in my gut, because I have that psychic awareness." She also talked to me about him like he was a human, but then she told me that she had communicated with him telepathically, and if I could see things through her eyes, I would understand what a phenomenal creature he actually was. "He's gone away," she told me, "because he died a couple of years ago from heart failure. He was very, very old." "How do you know all this?" I asked in amazement. "Because he visits me sometimes in spirit," she told me. "He says he's in a very happy place now, but he misses giving us piggybacks." "Are you still seeing dead people?" I asked her in horror. "Oh, yes, Mum. It doesn't stop, but you just block it out, which is what I do most of the time. But I have spoken to Herbert once or twice, and to that uncle that left you the farm more recently." "Really?" I asked. "Did you ask him why he left me this whole estate of his? I never did figure that one out." "He said that you were only a kid when you came to his farm once, and you have no recollection of it, but he never forgot the way you interacted with his dogs. He said that in that moment he decided he would leave everything to you because he liked your heart. He says he's glad you've preserved the integrity of his home, and he likes the way you run things on the farm." "You're kidding," I said. "He told you all that?" "Oh, and by the way, your mother sends her love. She's very upset with you because you never wear the pearls she left you." "How do you know about that?" I asked. "Because your mother told me," she laughed. I immediately went to my jewellery box and put on my pearls. "Mother, wherever you are, I hope you're happy. I'm wearing your pearls now." I have asked my daughter to write to you and share her stories with you about growing up with a Bigfoot who gave her piggybacks, and she's very eager to share her story with you. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Armel and I'm from rural Kentucky, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 2015 in an unlikely event where encountering a Bigfoot was the last thought on my mind at the time, and certainly the most unlikely place that I would ever expect a rendezvous with the hairy critter. I grew up in Kentucky with my parents and my brother Neville, and living in the rural countryside was the only life we ever knew. And I consider myself remarkably privileged to grow up surrounded by such exquisite, flawless treasures of the natural world. We grew up in a quintessential two-storey, whitewashed rustic farmhouse that had belonged to generations of our family before us. So over the years it has been renovated and restored, but the original foundations still actually stand. My parents transformed the lower part of our home into a large open-plan living space, where the kitchen, living areas and television room is just one large living space, and they also incorporated some floor-to-ceiling sliding doors on the lower floor so we could really appreciate the exquisite views over our large picturesque pond, the imposing statuesque mountains in the distance, the rolling green valleys, and of course the vast areas of dreamy forest that flanked the right-hand side of our property, which was an idyllic haven for the indigenous wildlife from the white-tailed deer, rabbits, foxes, squirrels, chipmunks, skunks and raccoons. Growing up, there were all kinds of television documentaries all about Bigfoot at the time, and I was certain that the ambiguous, mysterious creature did actually exist, because on our farm there was very clear signs of Bigfoot activity. But I was always heartily disappointed, because we never got to observe or see the hairy critter for ourselves. It was almost as if looking for Bigfoot made him become even more evasive and elusive, almost making me wonder if he actually knew I was looking out for him and was purposely hiding in the shadows and was making himself way too obscure to ever be detected. There was one occasion as kids when we were playing out in the woods that my brother and I got the very distinct impression that we were definitely being watched. But when we looked around the woods, we saw nothing was there. Yet we knew without a shadow of a doubt that we had been observed by unseen eyes. Later that day, we did discover these huge 17-inch footprints in the mud in close proximity to our pond, so we were pretty certain that they were from a Bigfoot. I do remember we even made plaster casts of the footprints, and they were colossal. On one occasion, my dad was convinced he'd actually seen the hairy humanoid cross his path when he was returning home one night, late after an evening playing bridge with a neighbour. My mother had fallen asleep in the front seat of the car, but awoke very suddenly when she heard my dad say, "What the heck? Well, I never in a month of Sundays. Did you see that?" "See what?" she asked, wiping the sleep from her eyes. My dad looked at her with eyes as wide as saucers. "I think I just saw a Bigfoot," he said excitedly, "but it moved too quickly for me to see it clearly enough. But I do not believe it could have been anything else, and it was most certainly not a bear." "Are you sure you're not mistaken?" my mother had asked him. "Very sure," said my father. "The kids are right. We do indeed have a Bigfoot on our land." Growing up, my parents were very close and very much in love, and were pretty much inseparable. We were a very close, loving family, but things fell apart when my dad was tragically killed riding a dirt bike in the countryside with a friend, and it would seem his bike lost traction and went hurling down a rocky embankment, while my dad's body was flung violently into a tree, killing him instantly. This happened when I was about 18 years old, and it shook our family incredibly hard, and I don't think any of us ever came to terms with his tragic sudden demise, because while you learn to live with tragedy, you never really fully come to terms with it. When I was about 30, after I was married, my husband purchased our old family farmhouse from my mother so that we could raise our 2 kids there and give them the fabulous outdoor life that we had heartily enjoyed ourselves at their ages. My brother Neville was a surgeon in Houston, Texas, and expressed no desire to buy the family farmhouse, so I was the one privy to buying it, and I snapped it out without a second thought. My mother remained in rural Kentucky, but she did value her independence greatly and didn't want to live with us, so she chose to move to a very attractive apartment block in close proximity to our farmhouse so that she could regularly visit her grandchildren, which is what she invariably did. Her apartment was on the ground floor with its own patio and large sliding doors, which overlooked the magnificent views of fields of pretty pasture where horses were frolicking and grazing happily, and in the far distance you could observe the hilly elevations of statuesque mountains rising up in the blue firmament like masterful giants, and on the rear side of her apartment it was flanked by a vast area of dreamy national forest that was accessible to the public with generous hiking trails and was superbly maintained by the Forestry Commission. My mother was in her 70s, and so she was lucky to be living in an apartment block that was so expertly managed by a fastidious, very scrupulous young manager called Christopher Ball, who ensured that the running of the apartments was plain sailing and assiduous. He ensured that the individual terrace gardens always looked exquisite with colourful seasonal flowers alongside perfectly manicured hedges and meticulously mowed lawns. Little did we know that behind the closed doors of my mother's apartment lay a deep, dark secret that was festering away and gradually getting out of control, and was something we were obliviously unaware of, because every time we would pick my mother up from her premises, we were never invited into her apartment. At that time I never smelt a rat, as I should have done, but thought she was so eager to see her grandchildren and wanted to get going, which was why she was always eagerly waiting for us in the car park to collect her. Little did we know that her smouldering secret was not going to remain suppressed for very much longer. One day I received a rather peculiar and strange telephone call from Christopher Ball, who said my mother's problem was getting way out of control and was actually attracting rats. He told me that the residents were very concerned about the huge infestation of vermin on the premises. They believed wholeheartedly that my mother was entirely responsible. As you can imagine, I was befuddled, because I had no idea what Christopher was talking about. But I quickly made my way to the apartment blocks to find out what on earth was going on. Why in the world would the residents believe my mother was inviting rats to the premises? Nothing made any sense at all. I was grateful that it was a Tuesday morning, as that was the time when the local bus would take all the elderly residents, which included my mother, of course, to the local town for a spot of shopping, so I could have a discussion with Christopher Ball about my mother's so-called problem. "I need to show you something," he told me. "Follow me." Christopher opened the door to my mother's apartment, and I nearly had a double heart attack on the spot. My eyes grew as wide as saucers, and my mouth dropped to the floor at this rude, horrifying awakening. It was like a bolt out of the blue, seeing my mother's apartment transformed into a deplorable dump. My mother's stinking apartment was so crammed with stuff from every single nook and cranny that you could barely even enter the premises, and I'm not kidding either. I was shocked because there were piles of newspapers and books piled on top of each other like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and they were absolutely everywhere. Apart from being a fire hazard, it was also potentially a death trap, because one knock in the wrong direction, you could be buried alive under a bunch of very heavy junk. Then, of course, the obnoxious fumes from dust, mould and venom scat were also a dreadful health hazard. It was incredible that my mother could breathe in this place. My mother's gritty, gross apartment was littered and cluttered with all kinds of articles, so many I can't even mention them. Boxes, plastic bags, and pretty much everything that you could even imagine to think about was stacked into hazardous high piles, and I was horrified to see that my mother was not even sleeping in her own bed, because even her bed was piled up with all kinds of odds and ends, and worse still, even her bath was full of bags of clothes, accessories, and kitchen gadgets. I realised to my amazement that my mother wasn't even having baths. She was being unhygienic, and was sleeping in a little corner of the room, almost like a vagrant. It was like I was walking into a rubbish tip, and I was completely floored and outraged that she was living in such objectionable conditions. I could hardly believe it. I personally was finding it difficult to breathe in her apartment, so I don't know how she could. It was so stuffy and rank, and the whole house smelt of sewage. It was so disgusting. How on earth had my mother lived like this for so many years behind our back? No wonder the neighbours were complaining about a rat problem. How and why had this happened, I asked Chris. I had no idea my mother was living in such squalid conditions. She hid this so well from us. "I'm sorry," said Chris. "I had no idea she'd been hiding the secret of hers from her own family. It invariably happens sometimes. It's called hoarding, and it's a condition where a person forms an attachment to everything she owns and simply can't let go of anything. Many of the residents here have observed your mother going through their dumpsters and examining piles of their rubbish to retrieve things that they've thrown away, like old ice cream cartons and plastic cutlery, for example. You see, a hoarder can find 100 reasons why the finished toilet roll should not be thrown away, because one day it could be useful for a school science project or something like that. They always find a reason to keep all kinds of crazy stuff that you and I would throw away instantly." "What am I going to do?" I said, looking at Chris with a hopeless, defeated expression on my face. "This has completely got out of control. And how could anybody live like this? It boggles my mind. I am well and truly stumped." "You need to get a counsellor to work with your mother as quickly as you possibly can, so we can help her throw this stuff away, because it is a huge health hazard to all the people in the apartment block. We need to follow the procedures, because your mother could have a mental breakdown if we just threw away her trash behind her back. You see, it's very likely she's attached to all her things, and will be very reluctant to part with any of them." Before long, a specialist in hoarding problems was actually working with my mother, and I was mortified to see how obstinate and resistant my mother was, as everything that the therapist suggested she throw away, she invariably found 101 reasons why the object in question was still exceedingly useful to her. "I need those," she said, pointing at the plastic cutlery we were trying to throw away. "What if I go on a picnic sometime?" I couldn't believe that this was actually my mother, the very same woman who raised me to be so particular, and who got so upset with us as kids if my brother or I so much as left a thing lying on the bedroom floor. But now she was the one living in a house of horrors. There was dust absolutely everywhere, on every available surface. Odours were virtually cemented into the carpet. A couple of dead rodents and a lone raccoon were found lying deceased, and their bodies dried up, buried and pressed down beneath piles of magazines. The carpet was now threadbare and had been devoured by hungry moths, and the apartment was teeming with roaches, beetles and rats. It would seem that there was a vast range of spider species making the most of this Aladdin's cave of delicious insects that were like a constant supply of fast food for them. They had layered down their silken webs in every available corner, and one web was so huge it was easily over a foot wide, and its resident was the fattest and largest spider that I've ever seen. One day we thought we had a breakthrough with my mother, when she suddenly agreed to throw out a lot of her stuff, and everything was hastily being sorted into piles. Now that she'd actually given us the green light to throw out as much stuff as we could, we worked quickly in case she changed her mind. There was one pile labelled stuff to keep, another stuff to throw out, and another was stuff to give to charity. We began to throw away large boxes of superfluous stuff that she would never ever need. I watched in horror as I saw my mother downcast expression as piles of her crap were being laden into the rubbish truck. How was it possible to be so attached to such squalor, I wondered in horror. What on earth had happened to my mother to make her develop such an attachment to so much of her stuff? Just when I began to falsely believe that things were going incredibly well, as my mother seemed to be putting up very little resistance in letting go of some of her stuff, one of my mother's neighbours surreptitiously called me to one side and told me that she'd seen my mother the previous night stuffing items in a shopping trolley and hiding them out there in the woods, and repeatedly making several journeys. "I saw her. She was creeping out of the house at 9 p.m. last night," she whispered. "She kept going backwards and forwards with piles of her stuff at all hours of the night. And I think she's hiding it all out in the woods for safekeeping so that you don't find it and throw it away." I was absolutely devastated to hear this alarming news, and so I made my way to the wooded area to observe how much stuff my mother was actually hiding from us. As I ventured ever closer to the woods, I could hear this loud rustling sound, and strange, rather animated chattering voices, and something in my head told me to tread very quietly and to remain hidden, which is exactly what I did, and I don't even know why I did it in the first place, but I did. I made my way behind one tree and quietly tiptoed to another and then to another, until I found myself in a perfect position to observe what was actually going on. It was here that I could see piles of my mother's trash, but it was who was going through it that startled me the most. Oh my God, I thought to myself, hardly daring to believe what I was actually seeing. It's Bigfoot! And better still, there were two of the critters, and I was able to observe them without being seen by them from only yards away. It didn't get better than that. How often when I was a child had I longed and yearned for an encounter with the hairy humanoid, and here at my mother's apartment block, yards behind her property, were two of these extraordinary creatures going through my mother's rubbish with animated enthusiasm. At least someone found her crap good. I was so spellbound by what I was observing that all thoughts of the immediate task at hand all disintegrated as I watched these critters with a mixture of total awe and wondrous amazement. "So you are real," I muttered under my breath. "I knew you were real." I was so excited and my heart was fluttering with impetuous eagerness of a young child at Christmas opening their stocking. I felt the same level of rapturous excitement, and I'm not kidding either. I stood there holding on to the wide trunk of a very large tree and peering ever closely to watch the Bigfoots, and they were so comical as they dived through my mother's stuff with such a passionate zealousness. I could tell they were really fired up as they rifled through things, and when they didn't know what something was used for, they would launch into this heated discussion together that sounded rather like gibberish, and they would speak to each other backwards and forwards for a very long time. One of the creatures was female because she had pert hair-covered breasts and was easily over 8 foot tall, 4 foot wide, and about 900 pounds. The other creature had a male energy about him, and although bigger than her, I sensed he might have been her son. He was about 9 foot tall, 5 foot wide, and easily over 1,000 pounds. They were both covered in long flowing chestnut hair, and they had those typical cone-shaped heads and overlong arms, so typically seen in Bigfoots. But one thing you never ever appreciate until you actually observe a Bigfoot for the very first time is just how extraordinary colossal these creatures actually are. I noticed that they were built like giants. They were very powerful, strong, lofty and majestic, and in my opinion, magnificent, awesome creatures. The female was examining an old handbag, and she had absolutely no idea what it was used for, and proceeded to try it on her head, but immediately took it off, realizing that the mouth of the bag would never ever fit her large head. It seemed that the critters had a heated debate trying to decide what the handbag was used for, and they couldn't come to an agreement about it. The creatures rifled through various containers, and when they found a plastic container with a lid that held all kinds of odds and ends, one of the creatures made an ooh sound and became incredibly excited. They looked at each other with a look of animated enthusiasm on their faces as they suddenly realized the storage benefits of such a container. I imagine they realized that they could store nuts or fruit in such a box, which seemed like a good idea to them. They discussed the container at length, with jubilant looks on their faces, and their passionate ardour was so charming to watch and observe, and it moved me to the core. When they came across 2 frying pans, they banged them together as if they were some kind of a musical instrument, and they were so pleased with the clanging sound that the pans were making, and seemed incredibly thrilled with them. The creatures seemed to think most of my mother's stuff was absolute rubbish, which they were right about, of course, as they threw aside magazines, bottles, and all kinds of clothes. The Bigfoots finally settled for the frying pans, a plastic container, and a large shopping bag, which they put to one side to keep. Yet for a very long time I watched them chattering away excitedly to each other as they continued to discuss the items in the trash. They would pick up the item, feel it, examine it, and even smell it, and then they would chatter away excitedly together about the object, as if they were pondering what a human would use a thing like this for, almost like it was some kind of a history lesson or something. After a long while I heard a very loud wood knock coming from a fair distance away, and the female immediately responded to the knock with a long drawn-out whistle that reminded me very much of a bird that I've often heard in the forest before. The 2 critters grabbed the objects that they'd selected from my mother's trash and glided back into the woods, and they moved like a seamless wind with such agility and grace. I imagined that a member of their family had been calling out to them. I stood there for a moment in utter silence. I was so stunned and overwhelmed by what I'd seen that I burst into happy tears. It was the most exciting moment of my entire life. I returned to my mother's apartment with a huge grin on my face, and no one could understand why I was so happy. I told no one what I'd seen, as I felt it was a secret that I just did not want to share. To cut a long story short, my mother did end up receiving counselling and was finally able to throw away all of her trash. My husband and I refurbished her entire apartment and laid down a brand new carpet, and we brought my mother a brand new bed as well, with the cosiest, most sumptuous bed linen. When my mother saw how exquisitely beautiful and spacious her home was, she actually broke down into fits of tears. She was so joyful. "It's so beautiful," she gasped. "I can't believe all the space that I have now." After the counselling, my mother changed and really got her life back in order, and now she keeps her apartment fastidiously clean and has adopted 2 gorgeous cats. The therapist believed my mother's excessive hoarding was an extension of the grief at the loss of my dad after the tragic accident on the back of his dirt bike. I asked my mother if I could keep the picture I found of my dad on his dirt bike, and I took it home and placed it on the refrigerator. Imagine my surprise when my young son Mark turned to his sister Lucy and said, "Mum has a picture of the man we've seen on the dirt bike." I looked at my children in shocked disbelief. "Have you seen this man before?" I asked them both in surprise. "We've seen him a few times riding his dirt bike on our land," said my son. "We did not know who he was, but he always smiles." I smiled to myself. My 2 children had seen their deceased grandfather on our land riding his bike, and it didn't get better than that. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, my name is Jennifer, and I'm from West Virginia. And one day, upon clearing out my attic, I found a large collection of old dusty letters that, although very old and weathered, were in surprisingly good condition, although rather crisp. I very nearly threw them away, but curiosity got the better of me, and I discovered an interesting letter written by a woman who claimed she was kidnapped by the Shawnee Indians and escaped in 1755. I believe she wrote this letter to an ancestor of mine, who would seem was her very best friend. After personally reading this letter, which I found to be incredibly fascinating, I thought I'd send you a copy, as during her extraordinary escape, it would appear that she encountered a Bigfoot, and so here is her miraculous and extraordinary story. Dear Roberta, written on the 16th of December, 1755. How much I've missed you and longed to see you again. It seems so long since I saw you last, but thoughts of you are never far from my mind, and you are forever in my heart, as always my very dearest, most beloved friend. No doubt you have heard of the grievous misfortune that struck down our family in recent months, an abrupt, unforeseen event that we would never have envisaged occurring to our beloved and close-knit family. Sadly, it would seem that we are not immune to tragedy, especially at such a turbulent time as this. It would seem that our relationship with the Shawnee Indians is not good these days, and they have a strong distrust of the pale faces. I cannot blame them for that, as the white man has given them much to be aggrieved about in our history, since we first came to the Americas, and seized much of their land. I can also see things from their perspective with a renewed unbiased understanding, as I've actually lived with the Shawnees. The events that transpired on that fateful day erupted so incredibly quickly that in an instant our lives were unequivocally changed forever, and I was not prepared for the shocking challenges that awaited me over the horizon, that left me staring death blindly in the face on many occasions. It was on the 13th of July, 1755, that about 7 Shawnee warriors raided Draper's Meadow and killed about 7 of our people, including poor Mama and little Puffface. May God rest their souls. Luckily, my husband managed to escape to the forest, but several of us were made captives, and that includes myself, of course. My sons were also taken captive, along with my mother-in-law. Sadly, that's all a long story, of which I wish to spare you the ugly, grisly details, as I have more pressing, rather curious issues at stake, a matter I wish only to share with you, my precious dear friend, as secrets have no boundaries between us. To put it in brief terms, I was so shocked by what had happened to us and felt an extreme hatred and indignation towards our Indian captors. But much to my surprise, the loathing dissipated as slowly they began to earn my respect, for these men were indeed impressive warriors that knew no fear. We travelled for many long, agonizing days, with many of our horses that had been rounded up and taken along with an abundance of our worldly possessions, which were deemed of great value to the Indians. The passage was irksome and maddening, and I grew weary and tired from the long, hazardous hike. The Indian warriors were intimidating, strong, powerful men, and, as I said before, impressively fearless in every regard, but they did treat us well. We followed the Ohio River until we reached Shawnee Town. I was taken to live with a Shawnee family, and my sons and mother-in-law were shepherded to other places further afield, although where they went I have absolutely no comprehension. But I could not allow my saddened heart to become discouraged over what I had little control or power to change. I could, however, rest in the knowledge that they were still living, and that was of a great relief to me. When I arrived at my residential abode, which was a wigwam, my clothes were ripped up into shreds by the Shawnee woman there. She was very nice, and gave me a highly decorated overblouse and leggings to wear instead, including a pair of comfortable moccasins. I initially spent my time sewing skirts with the Shawnee woman, which we traded along with skins and salt for goods, and the exchanges were very fair. I also helped them to grow squashes, beans and corn on their land outside the wigwam, which we cooked with all our meals. I noticed that there were many white people like myself that had been taken captives from the Virginian frontier, and they all looked resigned to their plight, which I fathomed to be of a grave impediment. After about 3 weeks or so, I travelled to Lower Shawnee Town and was taken to Big Bone's Salt Lick, where I worked at boiling the brine to make salt for my captives, for the purposes of trade, of course. It was then that I hatched an outrageous plan with one of the other white captives, who I tirelessly tried to befriend, although I hasten to say she was of a difficult disposition and a rather disagreeable countenance. I suggested we should escape and retrace the steps from whence we'd come with the Indian warriors by following the Ohio River. My friend was very certain that we would die should we attempt such a bold act of mindless courage, or be caught and killed by the Shawnee Indians if we were observed trying to escape from their clutches. Before long I managed to persuade her that my idea was indeed of sound mind, although not without perilous risk. I asked the 2 Indians who were in charge of the salt lick if we could gather wild grapes in the forest, as we were desirous to enjoy the taste of the refreshing sweet fruit that would quench our thirst. They permitted our eager request and gracefully agreed to let us go. I had hidden my tomahawk, a knife and 2 blankets in a large oak tree at the edge of a woods, and when the Indians weren't looking, I grabbed our supplies and we were well on our way. Our hearts were naturally filled with joyful resolve and eager exuberance for the long passage that lay ahead of us. Naturally, we were ignorantly blissful of the many perils that awaited us on our way. We were, of course, naturally wary that the Indians were searching for us, but hopefully they might conclude that we had been attacked and ravaged by wild animals. I don't believe that they considered us as pale-faced women to have a determined ambition to embark on a journey of escape, because they underestimated our tenacious spirits. I cannot describe to you in words the struggle of the arduous journey that lay ahead of us, that was not without personal sacrifice, as our clothes were torn and our bodies tired, wearied and burdened by this hard, laborious trek. Even our moccasins had seen better days and were wearing thin at the heels. We were scratched and bruised, and our appearance was far from agreeable, as even the sun had robbed us of our fair complexions. But vanity was far from our minds, as our interest now lay in getting back home. After 4 long days we reached the junction of the Ohio River, and it was here that fortune favoured us. We randomly stumbled on an abandoned cabin that was stacked with corn, and so we took a large portion which we carried on the back of an old horse we found grazing there in the backyard. This was not a wise decision of ours to undertake, because upon crossing the river the old horse sadly drowned, leaving us with only as much corn as we could physically both carry. Soon our corn supply dwindled and was hungrily devoured, which was troublesome because we were forced to live on black walnuts, wild pawpaws, blackberry roots and frogs. Yes, you heard right, we were eating frogs, and after a while they were not really that bad to eat. When you're driven by an intense, powerful hunger, it's amazing what you find palatable in such dire circumstances, let me tell you. As you know, Roberta dear, I have never been able to swim, so I marvel at how I managed to cross hundreds of rivers and creeks without drowning, although on many occasions we did make rafts with vine leaves and rafters and mercifully managed to get to the other side of the bank. And how we did this, I still don't know. One thing I'd overlooked was how the arrival of the treacherous, bitter cold winter weather would ravage us physically and emotionally, and when the summer bounty ran out, we were forced to eat dead animals that we found on our journey, some of it which made us exceedingly ill. Worse still, we often observed Indians out on their winter hunts, and were forced to remain hidden so that they would not observe us. We had come so far, and I was not about to become a captive again. I'm afraid to say that things didn't bode well with my friend, for she soon became angry with me for encouraging her to come on this journey, and became indignant, disheartened, and very aggressive towards me. The cold weather and heavy winter snow broke our resolve, and the continuous starvation really embittered us. It would seem that we became like savage animals, as my fair-weathered friend wanted to literally kill me so that she could eat my body for sustenance. I do not joke about such things, for what I am telling you is without exaggeration of any kind. As incredulous as this may sound, the power of hunger can drive you to extreme mania that you would never ever believe possible. We even drew lots to see who would be the sacrifice, and the lot invariably fell at my feet, as would be my luck. My friend was about to kill me, but I used my wit to persuade her that when we returned to Diper's Meadow, that my husband's father would pay her handsomely, and she seemed appeased by this attractive suggestion, but sadly that was not for long. This is when my story becomes extraordinary and very interesting, and is an account that I am only willing to share with you, for it is of such a bizarre nature that I sincerely doubt others would believe my story credible. But you know my nature, Roberta, and never have I told a lie before, nor am I about to start now. I assure you that this part of my story I have shared only with you, and no one else. Early one winter's morning, after a bitterly cold night spent in the woods close to the mouth of the new river, I was awoken to my friend holding me down, and in one hand she carried a heavy stone, of which she was about to bludgeon me to death. She cried out that her hunger was of such an intensity that our wager was no longer valid, and I was to be her sacrifice so that she could renew her strength and vitality and continue along her way. I struggled and screamed as she held me down with a forceful grip, of which there seemed no escape. I waited for the fatal blow, but it never ever came, because in that moment my friend was restrained by these huge, hairy, long arms, and the stone removed from her hands and promptly discarded and propelled over a long distance away. I was thrown on the back of this large, hairy creature who carried me away from the woods. At first I thought I was being lifted away by a bear. I was utterly terrified because I thought I was going to be eaten alive by this powerful, mighty beast, and my heart was filled with an impending dread. The creature ran with great swiftness of speed and determined resolve, and his agility and strength were commendable indeed. When we were a fair distance from the forest, he placed me safely on the ground. I realized that the creature possessed no ill intent towards me, but had rescued me from my friend. He had clearly witnessed how close I came to losing my life that perilous morning. I cannot describe this creature to you, for words fail me. Its stature was like that of a giant in its length, weight, and girth, and it was covered in fine, long, golden hair, of such a colour and fairness I would be desirous to have myself. Its shoulders were much wider and bigger than any natural man, and its head was shaped like a pyramid, and its long angular face expressed some clear human aspects that were very noticeable indeed, and yet all man he most certainly was not, and neither was he all animal either, but moreover a combination of both, it would seem. I have no comprehension of what this creature actually was, but for me he was like an angel sent from God himself, for he rescued me in a moment when my life would surely have been demanded from me that very day. This gentle creature was so kind to me, and knew great compassion and tenderness of heart. I watched him kill a deer on my behalf with effortless ease and speed, so the animal itself knew no pain. He gave me raw meat from his kill, and we sat on the river's edge and ate together. It was absolutely delicious, and I ate my fill, and kept some meat for my journey, as my wasted body could not eat too big a portion, but after my meal my strength was indeed restored. I thanked the creature in human words, although he did not speak as human language, but I knew he sensed my gratitude, and looked at me kindly with eyes that were the colour of golden honey. I pointed to the creature, expressing an eagerness to cross the new river, and he swam across the water with me upon his back, and I held on to him fast and firm. I will conclude that he swam like an otter, and it would seem that I was of no weighted consequence to him at all. When we got to the other side of the river, I watched the creature retreat back from whence he had come, and it was of no trouble for him, for his strength and power never waned. So impressive and mighty was this beast, and of an intelligence hard to fathom or comprehend, and a sensory perception that seemingly was not of this world. I have no knowledge of what he was, and that is my only vexation. I am very glad to inform you that I did finally reach my home about 6 days later, and was subsequently reunited with my husband. It was a moment of unspeakable joy, of which there are no words. "Mary, is that you?" he cried, holding my face in his hands, as he never believed that he would see me ever again, and surely thought I was gone from this earth. He was appalled to hear of my long, arduous journey, and how close we came to eating human flesh, an idea that was so abhorrent to his well-nourished state. Truly he had little comprehension of the real woeful consequence of true hunger. He was painfully aggrieved by the state of my small, frail form, that was so slight that my lightness is like that of a bird, for my body has cannibalized its own tissues. I am still eating little and often, as it is the only way to proceed, but I have seen flesh growing on my cheeks of late, and my clothes are less loose, but it will be a while to regain my full health and strength. Despite my friend's insidious attempts to end my life, the Holy Book teaches us to forgive, and so I felt compassion towards her, and she was soon rescued and taken to safety, but I do not wish to see her ever again, as you can understand. My husband and I are still farming in Dunkard Bottom, but I am very concerned for the future for fear of being attacked by the Shawnee Indians, because another journey of escape like this is too unspeakable to comprehend, and is one I would surely not survive again. My 2 children that were taken captive by the Shawnee Indians are still not accounted for, but they are forever in my prayers. Once I've regained my strength, my husband and I would like to try for another baby. So keep me forever in your prayers, that I will be strong and robust enough to conceive. I do hope your life has not been as eventful as mine, for never take for granted the days when your stomach is pleasantly full, and the world is quiet and subdued, for those days are the simple pleasures of life, and they are the most precious of all. Roberta, I long to see you, and ask that you might consider visiting us in a few months. I hope to persuade my husband to move away from Dunkirk Bottom, for fear our safety is indeed compromised here. Kindest regards and fondest love, Mary. This is a letter that was written to an ancestor of mine. I know the part about when the friend wants to kill Mary does seem unsettling and disturbing for your readers, and I do sincerely apologise for that. But it does give you a remarkable insight into the ravages of hunger that those two poor women must have endured, which in the cold light of day may seem barbaric and cruel, but was incredibly real. I believe Mary was a hero. She was brave, and against all odds she survived, and I'm sure that you agree with that. Also, I'm sure you agree that the mystical creature that she encountered was very definitely a Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Jack and I'm from West Virginia, and my Bigfoot encounter occurred in the summer of 1984 when I was working as a lumberjack in an area of national forest. But I also have a story to tell you from my grandfather that I'm sure you will absolutely love. I grew up in the 50s, and my parents and my younger sibling Patrick lived in a very spacious log cabin that was superbly built by my great-great-grandfather, who was an ingenious master when working with timber in those days, and he seemed to mould wooden beams together with such polished competence, like malleable putty in his hands, almost as if it was nothing. My great-grandfather went to the extra mile to creatively build his family the quintessential, most perfect, sumptuous abode, using the finest timber beams he could find that were of the highest quality. He created a very large, spacious, open-plan living area, which was innovative and forward-thinking for its time. I understand that the final finished masterpiece was the envy of all the locals in the area, as he had a natural flair of creating charming cabins that were aesthetically so pleasing to the eye and not just functional. Our family naturally inherited this expansive and spacious cabin, which physically was so stunning. It was stylized and decorative with a large wraparound porch that overlooked the most breathtaking and ravishing views. I can say this confidently and without any exaggeration, that this whimsical fairy tale-like cabin would have looked perfect graced on the cover of a box of the finest Swiss chocolates. Our pastoral cabin was nestled in the heart of a rolling green valley that was flanked by dreaming forests that projected back for many miles. The whole vicinity was full of meandering streams and exquisite mountainous views, and was always teeming with an abundance of indigenous wildlife. Even though I grew up in the 50s, during a time that we did not possess the technology that we have today, I don't ever recall a moment in my young life of ever being bored, as I believe my brother and I found so much to do, and were always very active, playing in the woods and getting up to all kinds of mischief, typical of young boys of our age. The natural world was an adventurous, exciting playground for us that was full of daily surprises and intrigue that always made life eventful and exciting. I came from a long family line of lumberjacks, and growing up it was a given that my brother and I would also follow the family tradition of felling trees, which is without question one of the most dangerous jobs imaginable. I say that because despite your best efforts, sometimes a tree might not accommodate your expectations or fall where you painstakingly envisaged, and that is when accidents do invariably arise. I knew of people who had tragically lost their lives as a result, in this abrupt, random and atrocious way. It was especially tricky in those days, as we didn't have the modern tools that they invariably have today, that have forever made lumberjack's life a whole lot easier and more manageable. Yet even so, despite the advent of modern technology, the lumberjack still risks a very strong likelihood of experiencing a tragic accident, so it still remains a very high-risk industry indeed. Growing up, my brother and I adored listening to our grandfather tell us the most incredible, prodigious stories around the log fire at night. I still advocate today that nothing on this earth compares to a good story, and it easily outrivals any other entertainment medium on the planet. I remember as a young boy we would all sit on these pieces of timber outside our cabin under the vast expanse of a darkened firmament that was so magically illuminated by the pearly moon and a scattering of silvery stars. We would be gathered together around a large fire pit, and as we watched the golden glow of the yellow-orange flames dancing, flickering and coiling around the wood, we would listen to the crackling fire, along with the orchestra of crickets and frogs, and the soothing sound of my grandfather's voice. I always remember how magical those evenings were. He would tell us so many stories about his life as a lumberjack, and the strange things that he had experienced and encountered in those woods, and my brother and I would sit there with eyes as wide as saucers as we hung on to his every word. My grandfather said that one afternoon, after a hectic, arduous day of laboursome tree felling, he began to chop some firewood from the less desirable pieces of leftover timber to bring back home to his wife for the wood-burning stove. He suddenly heard this peculiar rustling sound coming from the undergrowth, and his attention was immediately alerted, as he felt pretty certain that something was watching him, but he was not certain what or who it was. As he began to look around the immediate vicinity, he could hear this childlike giggling that sounded like kids up to mischief. He felt certain someone was playing a trick on him, so he called out to his partner, who was a renowned practical joker, "Bert, I know it's you. Come out." For a moment the giggling stopped, and all was very quiet and placid. "Bert," he repeated, "quit the big act. I know it's you. Game over, mate." Still there was silence, so he shrugged his shoulders and began to continue chopping wood. After what seemed like a long while, the uneasy, rather disconcerting feeling that he was being watched did not cease. Then very suddenly, like a bolt out of the blue, he discovered that something or someone was throwing acorns at him. They were hitting him so hard in the back, with almost perfect precision. Once again he heard the animated giggling. Every time he reacted with a look of heightened frustration and indignation. He was assaulted by a barrage of even more flying acorns, much like a dartboard being pounded by darts. He would hear this giggling almost as if whoever was watching him was gaining a great deal of satisfaction from his rising agitation and annoyance. By this time my grandfather had had quite enough. It had been a long, hard, gruelling and physically exhausting day for him, and his sense of humour was hanging on a knife edge. He was not even remotely amused by this pathetic, childish prank, and instinctively felt that Bert was deliberately trying to ruffle his feathers. He had noticed that morning, when they had been felling trees together, that Bert had been unusually playful and was cracking a bunch of corny jokes that were not even remotely funny, to say the least. It would seem that the only person on this planet Earth that found Bert remotely amusing was Bert himself. "Bert, I'm not amused," he said. My grandfather then walked towards the wooded area that was overgrown with grassy thicket and rambling foliage, where he was sure he would find his friend crouched down in the grass with a huge Cheshire-like grin on his face. As he ventured ever closer, he heard the scurrying of tiny feet, and that was when he saw them. He said that they were 4 little people, all of about 1.5 foot tall, who looked like they were fully grown teenagers. I believe they looked at him in alarm, as they were not happy to have been observed, and started to run away on their tiny little matchstick legs. It would appear that they were wearing animal skins on their bodies, and they had very white, pale skins, and hair that stood on end like a bird's nest. My grandfather eagerly ran after them, and he said they suddenly disappeared under this large fallen log that was carpeted in a thick layer of green moss. He was so blown away by what he had seen, and could not understand where these little beings had disappeared to so quickly and so mysteriously. My grandfather was to discover that many people knew about the existence of the little people, and from time to time they had indeed been spotted in North America, but no one really knew much about them. As my grandfather studied the area where they had been running, he observed these tiny footprints on the ground, confirming that these beings were very definitely physically real. Still feeling a rather befuddled by the previous day, the following morning my grandfather studied the moss-covered tree trunk more clearly. To his amazement he observed a small long vertical hollow in the log, and so he thumped around the hollow with his hand, and then he found something soft. At first he retracted his hand very swiftly in disgust, as he thought he was touching a mouse. But as the creature did not appear to move, he reluctantly pulled the soft thing out. To his amazement, he retrieved this perfect tiny little hand-woven basket and a very small piece of fur clothing that looked rather like a little jacket, which he was sure belonged to the little people. It was a distinct possibility that they had used this hollow tree trunk as a hiding place, which was why they had surreptitiously disappeared from his sight so quickly and seemingly vanished into thin air like ghosts. Some superstitious people believed that it was a bad omen that my grandfather had spotted the little people, and rumours abounded around the local town that my grandfather would be the next lumberjack to sadly lose his life in a tragic accident. But I'm glad to say it never happened. My grandfather had also heard about the Thunder People and had been warned by his own boss that should he encounter a Thunderman, that he was under no circumstances to share his experience or encounter with anyone. He told my grandfather that the authorities took a very dim view of anybody talking about the Thunder People, as it would cause a great deal of undue stress to the local inhabitants, who were predisposed to being superstitious and might regard the Thunderman as a harbinger of doom, and we couldn't have that. My grandfather was extremely vexed. He had no idea who the Thunder People were, and in truth he just thought the story about these weird-sounding people was just as erroneous myth, legend, or even superstition. But he was soon to find out how very wrong he actually was. One day, he said, after a long period of heavy rain where the ground was now very wet, he finally resumed tree felling in an area of national forest with Bert. It was then that they both discovered these enormous 17-inch footprints in the mud, and they were so shocked by their bizarre findings, as these footprints were not the making of a bear. My grandfather and Bert looked at each other in absolute horror as they placed their feet in these large footprints, and their feet were literally swallowed by the massive indentations. "What on earth made these footprints?" asked my grandfather. "It looks like we have a giant in our midst." He said that after observing these footprints, he and Bert became increasingly uneasy, because they sensed something colossal may be wandering around the forest, because something had clearly made those Titanic-sized footprints in the ground, and that was when my grandfather began to wonder if those footprints belonged to Thunderman. After several days of tree felling, one afternoon they heard the squealing of a sizable hog that had somehow got caught up and entangled in a thorny bramble bush and was trying to break free. Hogs are naturally notorious for not being the easiest things to catch at the best of times, so my grandfather was thinking that this would be an easy meal to take home to the wife, and he really quite fancied a hog roast for himself. I gather my grandmother knew how to make the best pork crocklet crackling, just so perfect, in addition to the sweetest apple sauce that you have ever tasted. As my grandfather was pondering all this in his mind and salivating over the thought of a delectable roast hog dinner, he also began considering the best way to kill and retrieve the hog that was now making a huge commotion, as it appeared to be wrestling vigorously with the thorny bush. It also seemed to become more and more ensnared, the harder it tried to escape. Suddenly my grandfather and Bert heard this booming, thunderous sound that reminded him of thunder, and it seemed to be accelerating through the forest like a steam train on full throttle. My grandfather said that the sound was so utterly alarming and so haunting, with such a supernatural airiness, that it literally filled him with terror. He said he froze to the spot like a large block of ice. Suddenly they saw this gargantuan, dark, shadowy form racing through the undergrowth towards them. On closer inspection, they discovered that they were staring at a huge, hairy, ape-like humanoid that was covered in dense, short black hair, rather like a black cat with white markings. The creature had a white zigzag marking down its chest, in the shape of a lightning bolt. My grandfather said that he was so petrified by the imposing-looking creature because it towered above them at about 10 foot tall, 5 feet wide, and easily over 1,000 pounds. My grandfather said he remembers that his whole body became paralysed, his hair stood on end, and he had a very strong urge to run away. But he said his whole body would not cooperate with him because he felt so powerless and incapacitated like a block of cement, so much so that he couldn't move a muscle. He told me he has never felt more helpless or vulnerable in his entire life. The hairy beast with its gargantuan shoulders and overlong arms lunged towards the thorn bush on his powerful, sturdy legs. My grandfather watched in total awe and amazement as the creature tore through the thorn bush with his humongous-sized hands and sausage-sized fingers, as if it was no obstacle at all. It was like the piercing, sharp thorns were of no hindrance to him. With effortless ease he dragged out this huge, terrified hog that was kicking and squealing for all it was worth. This hairy humanoid beast, with its cone-shaped head and Goliath-sized burly form, made the pig look like a soft toy in his hands. He took the hog by his back end and slashed its body so hard against the tree that the hog was killed instantly. Once he had killed the hog, he threw it over his shoulders and then looked towards Bert and my grandfather. It would appear that the hairy humanoid looked rather startled to see the two lumberjacks just standing there, and obviously he'd been oblivious to their presence all along. For a moment I believe Bert and my grandfather just stood there staring at the creature, and then it did the strangest, most bizarre thing. It actually pulled two of the hind legs off the back of the pig as effortlessly as a plum off a tree, and then it tossed one pig's leg towards Bert and the other towards my granddad. He then grunted as if to say, "I think you got a good deal there, since I've done all the dirty work for you." And then he glided away into the forest with a seamless grace and agility that was second to none. "What the heck was that?" was the first thing that Bert said once the creature had gone. He was trembling so much and shaking like a leaf. "I think that was a thunderman," my grandfather told him. Needless to say, my grandfather did indeed get a delectable, moist, juicy roast leg of pork after all, served with delicious crisp crackling apple sauce, roasted potatoes and cauliflower cheese, cooked by my grandmother just the way he liked it. He always wondered why the strange humanoid ape had gifted him and his friend Bert with this leg of pork, almost as an afterthought. My grandmother thought it might be because the creature believed that my grandfather and Bert had trapped the hog in the bush in the first place, so felt duty-bound to give them both a portion of the trophy as some kind of unwritten hunter's etiquette or code. My grandfather told his boss the very next day what had transpired, and the boss chastised him for talking about it. "I told you that you are not to talk about the Thunder People, because if locals get wind of these things, it will cause distress and upset among the people. I could also lose my job from my superiors if they knew we were talking about such things. Mind you keep that mouth of yours shut." Fast forward to the summer of 1984, and by this time I was working with my brother and a team of lumberjacks in an area of national forest. We weren't only felling trees, but also preserving the good trees and removing away any young seedlings or dud disfigured trees that lay beneath that were in the way. We were clearing away walking paths as well for hikers. When it was lunchtime, I sat down under a large cedar tree to eat my lunch that my wife had packed for me, which was a banana, apple, a bag of crisps and a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I ate my sandwich hungrily and began to think I was being watched, but I couldn't see anyone. I was about to eat my other sandwich when I noticed my banana and apple had mysteriously just vanished, which was exceedingly odd. Where had they got to? It was then that I just naturally looked up the tree, and to my utter astonishment I observed a hairy humanoid ape-like creature perched on a branch, much like my granddad had once described to me as a young boy around the fireside. To say I was awestruck and stunned is an understatement, but I was not fearful at all, not like my grandfather was, because this critter was only about 3 foot tall, and was definitely, I imagine, a juvenile thunderman. It was covered in long, flowing auburn hair that was a very attractive colour, and was eating my apple, looking ever so pleased with itself. It then twisted and contorted its body until it was hanging upside down from the tree branch, balancing on its 2 legs that it literally held between the branch. Its face was literally only yards away from me, and it began to stretch its overlong arm towards me and grab the sandwich from my hands very, very quickly, with a look of mischief in its golden eyes. He then twisted his body upwards again so that he perched upright on the tree branch. I watched him smell the sandwich and then open it up, and his pink tongue licked off the peanut butter and the jelly, much like a popsicle. He did this slowly and very enthusiastically, as if he was enjoying every mouthful. And then he threw the outer bread down to me in disgust, as if it was all superfluous, much like a banana skin. After a while the creature regarded me with a mischievous, naughty look on his face. I was so in awe of what I was seeing that I actually threw him up my bag of salted chips for the creature to eat. It played with the plastic for a while and shook the bag until it burst open on its own accord, and then he looked inside and tasted a chip. He then dived into the whole packet with incredible gusto and ate all the chips. I think he enjoyed them because he liked the salt. At the time I went dashing towards my brother to come and look at what I had just found, but when I returned the critter had disappeared and was gone. I never ever did see him again, but it made me fully aware that Thunder Man and the Little People were indeed true stories. All these years later, I realise Thunder Man is definitely Bigfoot, and it's a pleasure to share my story with you and your listeners. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.